The windshield had turned white, completely white, and Daniel Harper gripped the steering wheel of a dead engine, watching his breath freeze in the air while beside him, his best friend's daughter trembled beneath a thin coat. She was 26. He was 53. And the temperature was dropping faster than either of them wanted to admit.
Hey, look at me.
Emily's lips had gone pale. Her fingers couldn't
Don't
stop
close your
shaking.
eyes.
And when she finally
We're almost
spoke,
there.
her voice came out barely above a whisper. We need to share body heat. 5 words. Simple survival logic. Yet Daniel felt his chest tighten not from the cold, but from something far more complicated. The man who'd trusted him with everything was dead, and now his daughter sat inches away, asking him to hold her through the longest night of his life. What happened in that frozen car would test every boundary he'd ever believed in. The memorial service had ended 3 hours ago, but Daniel Harper could still smell the lilies. That cloying sweetness clung to his wool coat, mixed with the sharper scent of cold air now flooding through the truck's heating vents. He had turned the dial to maximum 20 minutes ago, but the warmth felt thin, almost apologetic, against the fury building outside the windows. The sky had darkened unnaturally fast, the kind of darkness that swallowed the last gray light of afternoon and replaced it with something heavier, something that pressed against the windshield like a living thing. Daniel glanced at the dashboard clock. 4:17. They should have been halfway to Burlington by now. Instead, they were somewhere on Route 112, climbing through the Green Mountains, and the snow had gone from scattered flurries to a wall of white that made the headlights useless. Emily sat in the passenger seat with her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around herself in a posture that made her look younger than 26. She had barely spoken since they left the church, and Daniel hadn't pushed. He understood grief well enough to know that words were often the last thing it needed. Her father, his best friend for 31 years, had been dead for 8 days now, and the service today had been the final punctuation mark on a sentence none of them had wanted to finish. Robert Chen had been 55 years old, healthy by every measure that mattered, until a blood clot decided otherwise. The kind of death that comes without warning, without goodbye, without any of the closure that people pretend exists but rarely does. Daniel had received the call at 2 in the morning, standing in his kitchen in boxer shorts, and for a full minute he had simply held the phone to his ear without speaking, as if silence could undo what Robert's wife had just told him. The memory of that moment, the cold tile under his bare feet, the hum of the refrigerator, the way his hand had started shaking so badly that he almost dropped the phone was something he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. Like a stone in his pocket that he couldn't quite bring himself to throw away, no matter how heavy it got. He had known Robert since they were both 22, fresh out of college and convinced they knew everything about the world. 31 years of friendship, and now, nothing but memories and a daughter who needed a ride home. Daniel Harper was 53 years old, and most of those years felt heavier now than they had any right to be. His wife Carol had passed 5 years ago, cancer that took her in 8 months, from diagnosis to the end, and since then, his life had settled into a rhythm of work, routine, and quiet evenings alone. His son had been in college when Carol died, and afterward, the boy had drifted away. Not out of malice, but out of the same gravitational pull that grief exerts on everyone, pulling them inward, away from the people who remind them of what they've lost. Now his son lived in Seattle, called on birthdays and holidays, texted occasionally when he remembered. The house that had once been full of laughter and arguments and the chaos of family life had become a museum of memories, each room holding ghosts that Daniel had learned to live alongside but never quite befriend. The truck shuddered. Daniel felt it in the steering wheel first, a vibration that traveled up through his palms and into his wrists, followed by a coughing sound from the engine that reminded him of his father's last winter. He pressed the accelerator gently, but the response was sluggish, reluctant, like an old dog being asked to fetch one more time. The temperature gauge, which he had been watching with growing concern for the past 10 minutes, now sat firmly in the red zone, and Daniel felt a familiar dread settle into his stomach. "Come on," he muttered, more to the truck than to himself. Not now, not here. But the engine had its own ideas about timing and location. It sputtered twice more, then died with a finality that left only the howling wind to fill the silence. The truck coasted forward on momentum alone, and Daniel guided it toward the shoulder, or what he hoped was the shoulder, since the road had become indistinguishable from everything else beneath the relentless white. Emily lifted her head. What happened? Her voice was hoarse, roughened by hours of crying and the dry air of the church. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He tried the ignition once, twice, 3 times, but each attempt produced only a clicking sound that grew weaker with repetition, like a heart giving out one beat at a time. The dashboard lights flickered and went dark. He sat back in his seat and let out a slow breath, watching it form a cloud in front of his face that hung there for a moment before dissipating into the cold air. The heater had died with the engine, and already Daniel could feel the cold beginning to seep through the windows, through the floor, through every gap in the truck's aging body. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin, it reached inside you and wrapped its fingers around your bones. Engine's gone, he said finally. Overheated, probably. The radiator's been leaking for weeks. I should've. He stopped himself. Should've didn't matter now. What mattered was that they were stranded on a mountain road in the middle of a blizzard that showed no signs of weakening. And every minute they sat here, the temperature was dropping closer to levels that could kill them both. He had seen what hypothermia could do during his years as a volunteer firefighter. It wasn't a peaceful way to go. Emily pulled out her phone, and Daniel already knew what she would find before she said it. No signal. Her thumb moved across the screen anyway, as if persistence might change the laws of physics, as if wanting something badly enough could bend reality to accommodate it. Nothing. Not even 1 bar. Daniel checked his own phone and confirmed the same. The mountains had always been unreliable for cell service, but during a storm like this, with the towers likely buried under snow and ice, they might as well have been on the moon. He looked out the window at the white chaos beyond and tried to calculate their options, running through scenarios the way he had learned to do during emergencies. They had passed a small town, Granville, he thought, about 15 miles back, but walking that distance in these conditions would be suicide. There's a cabin, Emily said suddenly. Daniel turned to look at her. She was staring at her phone, but not at the signal bars at the map she had downloaded before they left Burlington. One of those small preparations that suddenly seemed like the most important decision she had ever made. About a mile back. I saw a sign for it when we drove past. Some kind of rental property, or maybe a hunting cabin. Daniel tried to remember if he had seen any sign, but the snow had been so thick that he could barely see the road in front of him, let alone anything off to the sides. Still, a mile was manageable. A mile through blizzard conditions was dangerous, potentially even deadly, but it was better than sitting in a dead truck as the temperature dropped toward levels that would shut down their bodies one system at a time. Grab everything warm from the back seat, he told Emily. Blankets, coats, whatever you can find. We're walking. She didn't argue. That was something he had always appreciated about Robert's daughter. She understood when a situation called for action rather than discussion, when questions would only waste precious time and energy. Within minutes, they had gathered what supplies they could find. 2 wool blankets that Daniel kept in the truck for emergencies, his spare jacket that smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, a flashlight with half-dead batteries that flickered when he tested it, and a bottle of water that was already developing ice crystals around the cap. Daniel wrapped 1 blanket around Emily's shoulders, over her thin coat that was designed for style rather than survival, and took the other for himself. The wind hit him like a physical force, nearly knocking him backward against the truck. Snow drove into his face with such intensity that he had to turn his head just to breathe, and when he tried to open his eyes, the ice crystals felt like tiny needles stabbing into his corneas. He reached back and found Emily's hand small and cold even through her gloves and pulled her close. "Stay right behind me," He shouted over the roar of the wind, the words torn from his mouth almost before he could finish them. Don't let go. No matter what happens, don't let go. They started walking, or what passed for walking in knee-deep snow that seemed determined to drag them down with every step. The flashlight was nearly useless, its beam swallowed by the swirling white within a few feet. The mile felt like 10. By the time they reached the turnoff, Emily had remembered. Daniel's legs were burning with exhaustion, and his lungs ached from breathing air so cold it felt like swallowing needles made of ice. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves, and he could no longer feel his feet, which was either a blessing or a very bad sign. The sign was half buried in a drift, but he could make out enough letters to confirm they were in the right place. Mountain View, rental, private property. A narrow track led upward through the trees, barely visible beneath the snow, looking more like a memory of a path than an actual route. Daniel hesitated. If the cabin was locked, if it was too far, if it had collapsed under the weight of previous winters, they might not have enough strength to make it back to the truck. The cabin appeared out of the white like a ghost, taking solid form, one detail at a time. First, the roof emerged, a dark triangle against the swirling snow. Then the walls, rough-hewn logs that had weathered decades of mountain winters. Then the porch, sagging slightly to one side but still standing, still offering the promise of shelter. It was small, maybe 2 rooms at most, with windows that were dark and a chimney that produced no smoke. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, like something left behind by people who had moved on to better lives in warmer places. But to Daniel, it looked like salvation. He climbed the porch steps, tested the door, and found it locked. He didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into the wood once, twice, and on the third attempt the frame splintered and gave way with a sound like bones breaking. The interior was frigid, no warmer than outside, really, but at least they were sheltered from the direct assault of the storm. Daniel stood in the darkness, his breath coming in harsh gasps, and listened to the wind screaming against the walls like something alive and angry. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a counter with a small sink, a fireplace against the far wall, and a narrow bed in the corner covered with a dusty quilt. He spotted a kerosene lamp on the table and, after several attempts with fingers that had gone numb and clumsy, managed to light it. The warm glow revealed more details. Stacked firewood beside the hearth, a few canned goods on a shelf, a pile of old newspapers that would serve as kindling. He built a fire with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done it hundreds of times before, who understood that fire was both friend and potential enemy, that it demanded respect and patience in equal measure. Paper first, crumpled loosely to allow airflow. Then kindling, small pieces of dry wood arranged in a careful pyramid. Then progressively larger pieces, each one placed with intention, creating a structure that would feed itself as it grew. The matches were damp, and several broke before one finally caught, the small flame looking impossibly fragile in the vast cold of the cabin. Daniel cupped his hands around it, protecting it from drafts, coaxing it onto the paper with the gentleness of someone nurturing something precious. Within minutes, the first flames were licking at the kindling, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Emily had not moved from just inside the door. She stood with the blanket clutched around her shoulders, trembling so hard that Daniel could hear the fabric rustling against itself. Her lips had gone from pale to faintly blue, and her eyes had the glassy, unfocused look that he recognized from his first aid training as the early stages of hypothermia. The body was starting to shut down non-essential functions, redirecting blood to the core in a desperate attempt to keep the vital organs alive. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hands on her shoulders. "Emily, look at me." She blinked slowly, her gaze drifting toward his face but not quite reaching it, like someone trying to focus through thick fog. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. Everything that's damp." She nodded vaguely and began fumbling with her coat buttons, but her fingers were too stiff and uncoordinated to manage them. Daniel watched her struggle for a moment, watched her growing frustration and fear, and then made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. "Let me help," he said quietly. He kept his eyes on the wall behind her as he worked the buttons free, as he helped her shrug off the sodden coat and the wet sweater beneath it. He found dry clothes in a small dresser beside the bed, flannel shirts and wool socks that probably belonged to whoever owned this cabin, and handed them to her without looking, then turned away completely while she changed. The fire crackled and popped behind him, and Daniel Harper stood facing the door, thinking about Robert, about trust, about the weight of responsibility that had just been placed on his shoulders. When Emily spoke, her voice was stronger but still unsteady, like a radio signal flickering in and out. I can't stop shaking." Daniel turned around. She had managed to put on the flannel shirt and wrap herself in the quilt from the bed, but the trembling hadn't subsided. If anything, it seemed worse now that she was trying to warm up, her body's desperate attempt to generate heat through muscle movement working against her. "Come closer to the fire," he said. She moved toward the hearth, her steps unsteady, and Daniel reached out to guide her, but the trembling didn't stop. He added more wood to the blaze, building it higher than was probably necessary, but the cabin was still fighting against the cold that had accumulated during however many weeks or months it had sat empty. "We need to share body heat." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, her breath still visible in the air despite the growing warmth from the fire. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, not the cold, but something more complicated. Something that had to do with the woman in front of him and the man who had trusted him with everything, and the gulf between what was appropriate and what was necessary. He stood very still, his mind racing through implications and consequences, through the minefield of perception and reality. Emily must have seen the hesitation in his face, because she spoke again, more firmly this time. "I'm not being weird about this. I know how hypothermia works. I know what we need to do to survive. Body heat transfers best through direct contact. It's basic physics." Daniel thought about Robert, about the hundreds of fishing trips they had taken together, sitting in comfortable silence beside rivers and lakes, about the late nights drinking whiskey on each other's porches while solving all the world's problems, about the phone calls at odd hours just to talk about nothing important because that was what friends did. He thought about Emily as a child, running through his backyard with his son, their laughter carrying through summer air that smelled like fresh-cut grass and possibility. He thought about the promise he had made at Robert's bedside, 3 days before his friend had died, holding his hand while the monitors beeped their countdown to the end. "Look after them," Robert had whispered, his voice barely audible. "Be there when they need you." This wasn't what either of them had imagined that promise would mean. He sat down beside her, keeping a careful distance between them, and pulled the extra blanket over both their shoulders. The cabin had begun to warm, but the cold had sunk too deep into Emily's body to be chased away by fire alone. She leaned against him, and he could feel her trembling through the layers of fabric between them, could feel the desperate rhythm of her body trying to save itself. He put one arm around her shoulders, holding her the way he had held his son during thunderstorms when the boy was small and afraid and needed to know that there was someone bigger and stronger who would keep the monsters away. And he tried not to think about how strange this was, how it would look to anyone who didn't understand the circumstances. He maintained the boundaries he had set for himself: no unnecessary contact, no ambiguous gestures, just the minimum required for survival and nothing more. "Thank you," Emily said. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "For getting us here, for—" She didn't finish the sentence, and Daniel didn't ask her to. Some gratitude was better left incomplete, its edges too raw and complicated for precise definition. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire, listening to the storm rage against the walls of their temporary shelter, and slowly, so slowly that Daniel almost didn't notice it happening, the trembling began to subside. The night stretched out before them like an empty road with no visible destination. The fire had settled into a steady burn, casting the cabin in warm orange light that made everything look softer than it was. Outside, the wind had dropped from a scream to a moan. Emily had stopped shaking, but she hadn't moved away from him. "He talked about you," Emily said suddenly. Her voice was steady now, though still quiet, as if she were afraid of disturbing something fragile. "My dad, all the time. Daniel said this, or Daniel thinks that. You were like his reference point for everything, how a man should behave, what integrity looked like." Daniel felt something catch in his throat, an unexpected surge of emotion that he had to swallow back before he could respond. He had known that Robert valued their friendship, but hearing it confirmed through his daughter's words made it more real somehow, more present. "He wasn't perfect," Daniel said. "Neither am I. We just tried, you know? We tried to do right by the people who counted on us. Sometimes we succeeded. Sometimes we failed. But we kept trying." Emily was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could feel her thinking, could almost hear the gears turning in her mind as she decided how much to reveal. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, taken on a quality that Daniel recognized as the sound of truth fighting its way past the defenses we build around our deepest pains. "I've been so angry at him. For dying. For leaving. For not warning us somehow, like he should have known it was coming." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter edge of grief that has nowhere else to go. "I'm 26 years old. I have a job and an apartment, and I pay my own bills. I'm supposed to be an adult. But when they told me he was gone, I just felt like a little girl who had lost her father, and I didn't know what to do with that." Daniel understood. He had felt the same thing when his own father had died, 20 years ago now, that sudden, disorienting sense of being unmade, of having a piece of himself removed without anesthesia or warning. And then again when Carol had gotten sick, and again when she had died, and he had learned that grief doesn't diminish with repetition. It just becomes more familiar, like a room you've walked through so many times that you no longer see the furniture. "My wife passed 5 years ago," he said. "Cancer. Took her in 8 months, from diagnosis to the end. My son was in college then, and after she was gone, he drifted away. He's in Seattle now, calls on birthdays and holidays. But we're not close. Not like we used to be. The house feels empty most days." Emily lifted her head to look at him. In the firelight, her eyes were dark pools, reflecting the flames. "That must be lonely." It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered it anyway, because sometimes the statements that sound like questions are the ones that most deserve a response. "I've gotten used to it, mostly. You fill the space with work, with routines, with the small rituals that give structure to days that would otherwise blur into each other. You tell yourself that this is just what life looks like when you get older, that solitude is the price of survival. But sometimes I wonder if I'm living or just waiting for something to change, or waiting for everything to end, and not being sure which one I want more." "I almost didn't come to the memorial," Emily said. "I had this idea that if I didn't go, it wouldn't be real. Like I could just refuse to accept it and somehow that would change things. But then I thought about what he would have wanted. He would have said that grief is just love with nowhere to go, and the only way through it is together." Daniel felt tears prick at his eyes, the first he had allowed since receiving the news. "He was the best friend I ever had," Daniel said, and his voice broke slightly on the words. "I don't know who I am without him in the world. For 31 years, he was the person I called when I didn't know what to do. He was my compass. And now the compass is gone, and I'm just wandering." Emily took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried weight, acknowledgement, connection, the recognition that they were both drowning in the same water and might as well hold on to each other. "You're Daniel Harper," she said. "You're the man who drove 5 hours through a storm to attend a funeral. You're the man who carried me through a blizzard when I couldn't walk anymore. You're the man my father trusted with his life, and with mine. That's who you are. You don't need a compass to know that." The words landed somewhere deep in Daniel's chest, in a place he had forgotten existed. He thought about all the nights he had spent alone, wondering if his life had meant anything. And here was Emily, offering him something he hadn't realized he needed, the assurance that he still mattered. They talked through the night, not trying to comfort each other that would have felt false, insufficient, but simply listening, sharing the weight of their separate griefs until it became something they could carry together. Emily told him about her job as a graphic designer, about the apartment she had decorated with thrift store finds and framed photographs of her father, about the way she sometimes talked to him when she was alone, telling him about her day as if he might still be listening. Daniel told her about his woodworking, about the furniture he built in his garage because keeping his hands busy was the only way he knew to quiet his mind, about the rocking chair he had made for Carol that still sat on their back porch. They talked about regrets and hopes and the small moments that somehow end up meaning more than the big ones. Daniel woke to gray light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The fire had died down to embers, but the cabin had retained enough warmth that his breath no longer formed visible clouds. Emily was still asleep, curled up under the blanket a few feet away, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been the day before. The lines of tension had smoothed away during the night, and in sleep she looked younger, more vulnerable, more like the child Daniel remembered running through his backyard than the grieving woman who had sat beside him at her father's memorial. He watched her for a moment, feeling something that might have been paternal affection, the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood the particular loneliness that came from being left behind. He added wood to the fire and coaxed it back to life, then moved quietly to the window. The storm had passed. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but the snow had stopped falling, and in the distance, he could see the trees emerging from the white like survivors standing up after a battle. The world looked different in the daylight, softer somehow, as if the violence of the previous night had been smoothed away by the accumulated snow. Everything was buried, transformed, made new. There was a sound from outside, an engine. Daniel wiped the condensation from the window and saw a snowplow making its way up the road, followed by what looked like a rescue vehicle with flashing lights that painted the snow red and blue. He felt relief flood through him, but also something else, a reluctance he couldn't quite name. Emily stirred. She sat up slowly, blinking in the gray light, and for a moment she looked confused, as if she had forgotten where she was and how she had gotten there. Then memory returned, and with it a small smile that transformed her face. "We made it," she said. Daniel nodded. "We made it." The words felt insufficient, too small for what they had actually accomplished, but sometimes the smallest words carry the largest meanings. Nothing had happened between them that crossed any line. Daniel had made sure of that, had held himself to standards that some might have called excessive but that he knew were simply necessary. And yet everything had changed. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable, had shared truths that neither of them had spoken aloud before. The rescue team found them an hour later. There were questions to answer and forms to fill out, and the practical business of getting back to a world that hadn't stopped just because they had been temporarily removed from it. Daniel's truck was towed to a garage in Rochester, and they were driven to a nearby hotel where hot showers and warm food awaited. But before they went their separate ways, Emily to catch a bus back to Burlington, Daniel to arrange repairs for his truck and eventually make his way home, she stopped him in the hotel lobby. The morning light came through the windows at an angle that made everything look slightly unreal, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words were different. Not the reflexive gratitude of someone who has been helped, but something deeper, more considered. Not just for the survival stuff. Not just for getting us to the cabin or building the fire or any of that. She paused, searching for words that seemed to elude her. Thank you for being a man I could trust, for not making it weird, for treating me like... She stopped, her eyes glistening, and Daniel understood what she was trying to say without her having to finish. My father would have been proud of you, she said finally, for being exactly who he always said you were. Daniel didn't know how to respond. He had simply done what needed to be done, but he understood that for Emily, it meant more than that. He called his son that evening. It was the first time he had initiated contact in months, maybe longer, and his fingers hesitated over the phone before finally pressing the call button. The conversation was awkward at first. They had both grown unused to each other, had let the silence stretch so long that it had become a kind of barrier. But Daniel pushed through the discomfort and talked about real things. About missing him, about wanting to be closer, about the regret he felt for all the distance that had accumulated between them. His son listened, and when the call ended, Daniel thought he detected something in his voice that sounded like the beginning of a bridge, the first tentative boards laid across a chasm that had seemed uncrossable. The drive home took 4 hours. Daniel's truck, newly repaired with a radiator that no longer leaked, hummed along roads that had been plowed clear of the previous night's fury. The sun had come out, turning the snow into a glittering expanse that hurt his eyes, and the radio played old country songs that reminded him of road trips with Carol, with Robert, with the people who had shaped his life and were now, one by one, leaving it. But for the first time in a long while, the memories didn't feel like wounds. They felt like gifts. He thought about Emily often in the weeks that followed, not in any inappropriate way, but with quiet wonder at how two people could share such an intense experience and then return to their separate lives. Emily continued her life in Burlington, carrying with her the memory of a night that had almost killed her, and had instead given her something unexpected. Proof that there were still good men in the world, men who would do the right thing not because anyone was watching but because it was simply who they were. She didn't tell many people about what had happened. The story was too easily misunderstood, too vulnerable to the kind of assumptions that people make when they hear about a man and a woman alone in a cabin. But she held on to it privately, a small flame against the darkness of her grief, a reminder that her father's faith in his best friend had been justified. She sent him a card 3 weeks later, thanking him again, and included a photograph of her father that Daniel had never seen before, Robert, at 25, standing beside a river with a fishing rod in his hand and a smile that held the whole world. On the back, Emily had written, I found this in his desk. I thought you should have it. He would have wanted you to remember him like this, young and happy and full of all the adventures you two would share. Thank you for being his friend, and thank you for being mine when I needed one most. Daniel framed the photograph and put it on his mantel, beside the pictures of Carol and his son, and the other fragments of a life that had somehow accumulated meaning despite all the loss. He looked at it often, especially in the evenings when the house grew quiet and the absence of other voices pressed in around him. But the silence didn't feel quite as heavy as it once had. Something had shifted during that night in the cabin, a recognition that his capacity for care hadn't died with Carol, hadn't been extinguished by his son's distance or Robert's death. He was still here. He still had something to offer. He was still capable of being the man that Robert had believed him to be. The first warm day of spring arrived in early April. Daniel took his coffee onto the back porch and sat in the chair that had been Carol's favorite, watching the birds return to the feeders he had kept filled through the winter. The air smelled of melting snow and the first hint of green, and somewhere in the distance he could hear children laughing, the neighbors' kids, probably, celebrating the end of the long, cold season. The rocking chair beside him was still empty, would always be empty, but somehow that emptiness felt less like an absence now, and more like a presence of a different kind, the space left by someone who had been deeply loved. His phone buzzed, a text from his son, thinking about coming home for a visit. Maybe next month? Would that be okay? Daniel read the message twice, feeling something bloom in his chest that he almost didn't recognize. Hope. That stubborn, persistent thing that refused to die no matter how many times he tried to bury it. He typed back a single word. Please. Some nights don't change your life. They simply remind you that you're still capable of care, restraint, and humanity. Daniel Harper had survived the blizzard. He had survived the loss. And as he sat on his porch watching spring unfold across the mountains, he understood finally that surviving wasn't the same as living, but it was a necessary first step. The rest would come, one day at a time, one small act of connection at a time, one moment of presence at a time. The coffee grew cold in his hands. He didn't notice. He was too busy watching the world come back to life.